Well, thank you so much, Colleen, and thank you everybody for inviting me here this evening for a fairly quick time. Time is always of essence and a struggle, because it's yeah, I can't say. Usually, I do some work around helping people to understand the difference between the way many Indigenous people and communities view time, and then our Western way of viewing times. And certainly in the medical world, I'm sure many of you know that that's a huge issue. Is how do you spend appropriate time, meaningful time with clients, patients, and communities in a way that's relational when we're in a system that defines time differently for us. So rather than saying more about that, I'll move on because of our time. But certainly that's always a struggle that we have in doing this work. Thank you for the introduction, Colleen, and I want to add my gratitude for the traditional keepers of the land that I currently live in. I live in the Comox territory, and there's the Satlut, the Pentlach, and Ayexan people that live there as well that make up the Comox Nation. And I'm so thankful for the relationships that I'm building there. I'm not from that territory. I'm from, as was mentioned, from Saskatchewan, but I've lived in BC and on Vancouver Island for over 25 years now, off and on. So very thankful for the relationships that I'm building there. I consider myself an uninvited guest into those territories because I've fallen into colonial patterns myself. But I am on a journey of hopefully one day being considered an invited guest into the territories as I build relationship with the Comox people and take direction from them on how they would like to see me doing the work that I do. I also want to acknowledge on this call the elders that might be on this call. I'm not familiar with your group, but I do want to acknowledge those people that you've been looking to for guidance in terms of working with Indigenous people. So if you're on this call, I want to acknowledge you as well and all of the hard work that you've been doing amongst your colleagues and friends here. I also want to acknowledge the land itself because we need the sustenance and the strength of the land too. And once again, thank you for inviting me here. I just wanted to say a quick word about protocols because if we're in a big public gathering, face to face, you would probably have a representative of the host First Nations in this area inviting or welcoming you, and you would do your acknowledgement, and then that welcome might include singing and chanting, prayers, ceremony, songs, drumming, all kinds of what we often call customs and protocols. So I got curious about the word protocols a while ago, and I looked it up, and it comes from the book binding process, and protocols literally translates into first glue. So the glue that you apply to the spine of a book to hold it together. And when I read that, it made sense to me as an Indigenous person who knows the importance of protocols and customs, because the purpose of them is to activate the glue that holds us together as individuals and as people coming together to do work that we might have in front of us. So I really like the word protocols, and that's why they're important. It helps us to be, who we can be in our fullness, so that we can do work together, especially when it's difficult work that's in store in front of us. The presentation process for me is I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then I want to open it up for questions and comments. And we need those protocols and the activation of glue that holds us together because of everything that we're carrying in this moment. The challenges of this pandemic that isn't over. And we're noticing more and more fractured relationships and struggles and conflicts that people are having. And it seems like there's an increase of violence in our communities. And I know that downtown East Side is going through some really difficult periods in terms of the treatment of people that live there and all of the complexity of that. And we've seen an increase of terrible violence. And I was deeply impacted by what happened in Saskatchewan with the James Smith Cree Nation. That I'm not from there, but I'm close enough that it deeply impacted me. And of course, I was worried about my relatives that live in that area. So, and then we have the wars that are going on, many wars that are going on across the world. And certainly what's happening in the Ukraine is impacting us. and the climate crisis that so many of us are worried about now. So we are carrying a lot in this moment, and it's important to remember that. And that's why activating that glue that holds us together is so important. The nature of this work that I do and that many of you engage with in terms of decolonizing and truth and reconciliation and creating Indigenous culturally safe spaces, it's hard work because there's a lot of things that we have to sort through. So again, it's important to do those things that help us to hold ourselves together in meaningful and holistic ways. And then how do we treat each other in ways that help us to stay together as we do this difficult work. So we always recommend in the work that we do to be kind with yourself, to look after yourself, and then to be kind and gentle with others as well. Anything that I talk about, I look to documents like the TRC calls to action, the In Plain Sight report, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Commission and Recommendations, and Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Those have been really helpful processes that guide the way that we do our work because they make recommendations and they sort through all of the stories and they present to us a way that all of us can engage with. So those are very important in the work that we do. So I just want to speak very quickly to what Indigenous cultural safety is and the origins of it. And I always like to tell this story because it allows me to raise my hands and give thanks to the Indigenous people of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, the Maori people, and in particular, Maori healthcare professionals, nurses and other healthcare professionals who are primarily women. So I get to raise my hands, and it's important for me as a male in this society to recognize the strength and the genius and brilliance of women, and specifically in this case, Indigenous women that brought forward this concept over 30 years ago now in the struggles that they were experiencing in the healthcare world, especially how they witnessed their communities being treated in a Western healthcare system where they were being discriminated against and treated poorly and ridiculed, especially if they didn't speak English and that they still practiced the old ways. And then as these Maori professionals tried to inform their non-Indigenous colleagues, they were often shut down as well. And so they brought this concept forward to how do we create a sense of safety in the healthcare world, especially as it applies to Indigenous people. You know, cultural safety is for everybody. Everybody that walks in this world perhaps differently should be honored in a culturally safe way, no matter what your culture is. Absolutely, that's true. We focus on Indigenous cultural safety because if you look at the data, you'll see that Indigenous people in the healthcare world, in the judicial system, and so many facets of society, we're always at the top of the list in terms of disparities. And so that's why we focus on Indigenous cultural safety, because we want to affect it. We want to change that circumstance and that impact and that outcome. This is a definition that comes from First Nations Health Authority. There's actually lots of definitions out there if you look at the literature. But if you notice this definition, it's hoping to achieve an outcome that helps with building respectful engagement that tries to address the power imbalances found in the many systems around us in the healthcare system. So looking at patterns of racism and sexism and all those kinds of isms, we have to look at how they show up in our systems. That's the work of cultural safety. It includes work like cultural awareness and sensitivity and competence, but it also focuses on looking at the system in and of itself to identify how power imbalances show up in those systems so that we can do something about it. We can start to make adjustments and changes. But yet it's a aspirational place. We have a long way to go in every system that we're working in. So then that begs the question, how do we get there? So once again, First Nations Health Authority has brought forward a concept of cultural humility, and it's the process that helps us to get there. A careful process of self-reflection to understand our own biases that we carry, and then how those show up in the systems around us as well. And I'll let you read the rest of the definition there. So then I'm going to move on here, and I apologize if I'm moving quickly, recognizing our age-old struggle around time. So the cultural safety and humility learning process looks like this, especially if you look at the literature. It talks about the first stage as being building our knowledge and understanding. You know, there's so much has happened in our society in terms of our experiences as Indigenous people throughout history that not many people know about. So we have to build our knowledge and our understanding. Understanding is adds to not just knowledge, but understanding. If you look at that word, it actually means in the midst of. So how do we find ourselves in the midst of that structure as well, so that we can work in ways that are meaningful for us as individuals too. The second step is around skills. So what are the necessary skills that are required to help us move to a different place? So this might be things like anti-racism or trauma-informed practice, or working within complexity, or mindfulness, or working at being dealing with your regulation, self-regulation and co-regulation. There's a whole myriad of skills that are important in this work. And then the third step is action. So then what can we do about it? And how do we make sure we're collaborative in our action? And how do we be on a journey where the action emerges out of the increase of our knowledge and understanding and our skill building? And as we start to connect with our communities around us, we allow for the action to emerge out of those interactions. Then we add a fourth step to all of this that actually becomes the first step. And it's building the container, going through a careful process. It's the protocols and the customs and the building of a process. And I often use, or I always use, the circle process to help build that place where we can look at the uncomfortable, which is so necessary, and it increases our capacity to hear that which might be difficult. And then the purview that we take in doing this work, especially at the beginning, is often people will call this a 10,000-foot view, a balcony view. I call it the side of the hill view. So how do we come up to a safe enough place where we can look at that difficult history and look at the current realities and impacts, and then maybe even start to identify some ways forward. And then another piece of this work is locating yourself in this picture. So where am I? And then from this vantage point, you can identify paths around you that maybe you didn't know about, or colleagues around you that you didn't know about. So this is a good place to look from, a vantage point. Some people call it systems thinking, but certainly it's an Indigenous way of looking at a problem. And then also just imagine that we've walked up to this vantage point together. We always talk about the backpack that we're carrying. You know, we always say to people, you have skills, you have stuff in your backpack already that's important, and you can share that with each other. And we can also put new items into our backpack that help us on this journey. Same vantage point with this picture, but now we're looking at a road. So that's a metaphor for the colonial structures that are now part of our experience in this life. So we have to understand those structures to help us figure out what to do with them. Like where are the strengths of those structures, and where are the problems within those structures that we can actually consider changing. And I always like to share this picture because it's referencing Mount Fuji in Japan. So I often tell people, especially for those that come from other parts of the world, as we talk about this work and we look at that history, especially around colonialism, people from other parts of the world start to see similar patterns with their own experiences. And then those stories that they share about their experiences from other parts of the world become really important and informative in this work. And then we always use the circle process in our work, and I'm not going to go into too much detail with that, other than to talk about what the foundations of the circle process. And we've learned this from doing work for so many years in Indigenous communities and learning from elders and knowledge keepers. And they often will talk about the foundations to the circle are values. And so they'll talk about humility, they're recognizing that we're all connected and interdependent, and we need each other for this journey, and to remember that even though we live in a society that tries to say that some folks have more value than others, we try to remember in the circle that we actually are of all of this. We all are of value, and everyone's voice is important. Everybody's thoughts and opinions and reflections are important. So we take the time to hear from everybody. And so respect, if you break this word down, it means re-looking. So just imagine if we ask one question of the circle, then everybody gets an opportunity to share their thoughts about it. You end up with a really robust understanding because everybody's had input. So it's just a really helpful way of sorting through and figuring out ways forward. We always recommend to highlight integrity of, walking in a principled and ethical way, holding yourself with integrity that come from the teachings that all of us carry from many different places. And then also treating each other with integrity. And especially the stories that we tell in our circle processes. We remind people that the stories that people tell belong to them. And the details of those stories should stay in the circle because we're holding that with integrity. But we learn from each other's stories, and that's more than fine to share, especially what we're learning about ourselves. But the details of the story stay inside the circle because we're holding them with integrity. Generosity is having that kindness to share that which you might have where somebody might be in need. But there's also more to it as well. If I think about the beginning of that word generosity, it's the same part of the beginning of the word of generations. So then that story, when I connect it with generations, it reminds me of that old story that says, true kindness is when old men plant trees, knowing that they'll never experience the shade or the fruit of it, but they do it nonetheless. And I think about that in terms of truth and reconciliation and trying to transform our society. We might not see the full impact of it, but that shouldn't stop us. We should still take the steps that we can in our day and age, in our time, in order to affect change down the road for the future generations. We ask people to show up from a place of courage, from that deep place within you. The root of this word is heart. So we ask people to share from their heart in this work. And we know that it's scary. We're asking people to be vulnerable, and that's not an easy thing. Courage is a good value to hold on to in this work. Empathy is being able to recognize when somebody is struggling and having a difficult time, that we can let them know that we can be there for them. But we can recognize that in somebody else because we've all gone through struggles and loss and heartbreak and those sorts of things. And that's how we recognize it in somebody else. And so sharing from that place and connecting with others from that place that might be struggling is so important. And then the last one that we often talk about is fortitude. If you break this word down, it means strength of mind, forte and tude. And so we need that. We need to put our minds together to figure out a way forward. There's also more to it in my mind as well, because we do a lot of work around understanding trauma and its impact on us. And trauma often gets lodged in our brains and in our nervous systems. And so to me, fortitude, strength of mind, is speaking to a healed mind as well, or at least on a journey of being healed. And so fortitude to me also references healing. These values are universal values. These are not just Indigenous values. And so that's why I like them too. These speak to all of us as human beings that are interested in creating stronger and more equitable communities. And so vulnerability is so important in this work. I can't say that enough. I can't stress that enough. That's that building that container part of this work, is so that people can share from a deep place. And I always like to share the story from Brené Brown. And I won't go into who Brené Brown is. I'm sure there's many fans of Brené Brown. She's a well-known shame researcher and does a lot of work helping people to look at that which they might carry, so that they can be better partners and parents and all sorts of things. But she told a story a few years ago when Black Lives Matters was big in the news in the United States several years ago, and of course it is again recently. She's talked about how the biggest issue facing the United States is the issue of racism. And I add to that, I say also Canada. And then the current Black Lives Matters movement has shown us just how global the phenomena of racism is. So it's a global issue. She goes on to say, but we're not having the deep dialogue to actually create change. Something always stops us. And in her mind, and she's racialized as white herself, and she says that one of the main reasons why is, she says, if you want to talk about racism, eventually you have to talk about privilege. And that's what often shuts down conversations, because defensiveness comes up, or guilt or shame comes up, and we do all sorts of things to push away that discomfort. And so, and she says that shame is held in place by three things: by secrets, the things that we don't even know or aware of. And certainly in doing this work around Indigenous cultural safety, there's so much that we don't know that has occurred here in Canada in terms of Indigenous experiences and perspectives. And much of our work is going through the many things that we need to know about that have been kept secret. And then the second one is silence. And this is both the silencing of the voices that could have been and should have been informing us all along, but they've been kept silent in so many different ways. And also the silence of our own voices. And when we do notice that something is amiss, that we sometimes don't know how to speak up, or we're fearful of speaking up. So oftentimes our voices are silent as well. And then the last one is judgment. And for me, this is speaking to the narratives, the stories that we do know about Indigenous people that come from Hollywood and myths and misconceptions and stereotypes, and from those stories that are repeated over and over again around kitchen tables, among friends, among family, that are based in myths and misconceptions. But when those form our narrative of what we do know, we judge situations based on those myths and misconceptions. So that's how I think judgment plays into this in the form of narratives. The cool thing that she says is that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. So again, creating the space that we can have these deep conversations is so important. And then she says that vulnerability is the gateway to creativity and innovation. And some of her work, she also talks about it's the birthplace of joy and authenticity and so many useful things. But we have to also embrace the difficult and uncomfortable part of this, the history and what we're up against. So these are, I'm almost through my slides here. I have about 6 or so foundations to this work that I wanted to share with you, and I've already been referencing them. So I won't go into them in too much more detail, but looking at the history and the current reality from Indigenous perspectives is so important in this work. And so that builds our knowledge and our understanding. And then expanding our narratives, we often call this a skill. That we have to look at not just only the impact and the story of the impact, but also, so what are the roots of it? Let's peel back the roots of and try to figure out, so why did these things happen? Why did the patterns of colonization be, why are they in place to this day? And then the skill of self-reflection, that's a really hard thing to look inward at the biases and behaviors and attitudes that you might carry, but it's so important in this work. And so we build careful processes to assist people in doing that look and journeying together with others as well. Trauma-informed practice. I can't say enough of how important trauma-informed practice is to this work. Understanding the impact of trauma in our society is so very important. So building the skill around trauma-informed practice is so important. Anti-racism. And I want to say this about anti-racism. Anti-racism isn't simply not saying terrible things. Anti-racism is about challenging, identifying, and changing the values and systems that are in place within our society. So it's not just learning how to be appropriate, it's learning about, so how do we root out the structures and the attitudes and behaviors that support ongoing systemic racism. And then working within complexity, because these are complex issues and situations that we find ourselves in. So embracing the skill of recognizing complexity and then working within that. Because sometimes complexity scares us away. It's too complex for us. Let's not bother. But there is a skill that you can develop around working within complexity. Restorative practices, because this work is fraught with making mistakes. And in fact, making mistakes is where some really powerful learning happens. So if we've made a mistake and we need to address or restore a relationship, then developing practices and skills around that is also really important. And then somatic experiencing. I won't say too much about this, but this is how your body experiences colonialism and racism and all that sort of thing. It's the leading edge of the anti-racism work right now. We haven't talked about this for a long time or nearly enough over the last several decades in the work that we do around anti-racism and decolonizing, but recognizing how our bodies hold the impact of colonization. All of us experience the impact of colonization in our bodies. So we have to do a lot of learning around that, and then understanding that what we can actually do to start to create a difference in how we hold the colonization in our bodies. And then self and co-regulation. We've just learned how this is so important to know how to center yourself, to know how to be present as we're having difficult conversations and sorting through really difficult things. So the practice of self-regulation is so important, being centered, being grounded, and then that supports co-regulating others in this work as well. So I think this is the last thing I'll share with you. It's a quote from an Indigenous activist group in Australia. And it says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. We have to recognize that there's structures, that have created colonization that are still in place to this day, and they're actually damaging to all of us in various ways, in varying ways. But all of us are experiencing and basically suffering from colonization within our society. So when we come to recognize that and how it's damaged all of us, then we can start to work together to liberate ourselves and each other from colonization. And this is the person that it's mostly attributed to. Lila Watson will say, she said it in a speech, but it came out of a collective of people doing this work together. So I think that's all I have to share with you, other than to say that thank you for inviting me here today. And I like this slide. A friend of mine, Lily Hahn, shared it, likes to use this slide because it's reflective of the journey that we're on, that we feel like infants in this work sometimes, and that slogging through wet sand is hard. We don't quite know what the goal is, but we're heading towards it anyway. So this work can often feel that way. And we need each other in doing this work. We need to support each other and hold each other up in this journey. So that's all I'll share for now. I'll stop sharing my screen. And love to hear your reflections, comments, thoughts, questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. And it will hit home for a lot of people who are listening to you, Harley. So I don't know if there are, I don't see any hands, and you're getting lots and lots of thank yous in the chat, including Kleko from Daniel Cook, whose language that is. Are there any questions? Does anybody have any comments about the?
Yeah, Sherry here. I would love if you care to share just about the restorative processes. I have definitely experienced that, the need for that in some of my own community organizing work. And if you care to share a bit more about that and what that looks like, would love to hear more of your reflections on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I didn't share a lot about who I am and the work that I've been doing for 25 years. So I do apologize for that. I wish there was more time so I could share with you the various work that I'm doing in many different sectors. And I've been involved in restorative justice for about over 25 years now, kind of internationally. But I have to tell you that I actually left the work for a while because I was frustrated, because it seemed like a big part that was missing for me in restorative justice was people looking at themselves and being self-reflective of that which they might carry, and how recognizing things like race and places of birth, gender, and all of those have dynamics that we have to be aware of, right? And especially when those patterns have produced abuse of power, or there's a history of that, we have to look at ourselves. So and for folks that don't know about restorative justice, it's based on Indigenous ways of dealing with conflict holistically. So it's bringing in all kinds of understandings and building a space where the people who are in conflict can work through that together by sharing the stories of the impacts and their experiences. And from those stories emerges ways of restoring relationship. And in some cases, sometimes we think there's been a relationship, but we don't realize that maybe it's been a relationship of power imbalance, but maybe we've been blind to that. So I think authentic restorative practices brings that in and helps us to understand the depth and the complexity of relationships, and then helps us to restore or to change relationships if there's been a pattern of power imbalance that we weren't even aware of. I don't know how much more to say about that, but it's so imperative in doing this work. I actually feel like the work that I do, addressing colonization, is at its essence restorative, because I really believe that we live in a country, and this is where, if you dive into the knowledge portion from Indigenous perspectives, you start to realize that this country has never had a good relationship with Indigenous people. Maybe for a couple years at the beginning, 400 years ago here in Canada, but after that, it changed into conflict, and we've never figured that out. So I really believe we live in an intractable conflict society, and we've just normalized it. We don't even realize that we live in that. So restoring, a sense of what it means to be in a nation-to-nation relationship is so important in all of them. And I think that's the ultimate goal of restorative justice and restorative practices.
Thank you. Daniel.
Thank you, Colleen. Harley, I was curious about, you were mentioning that we are holding colonialism in our bodies. And I'm curious on where you further that awareness. Is there, I'm curious about more about that.
Yeah, there's lots of people that are doing that work now, recognizing that. And I think of the work of Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate. I'm sure many of you know him, probably familiar to your community. But he talks about that, right? When the body says no, and in the realm of hungry ghosts, all of that is referencing the impact of trauma and patterns of survivorship on our, and how that impacts our bodies, and then that becomes normalized. So I always highly recommend the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, and many others are doing that work. Dr. Peter Levine. One of my favorites is a more recent person on the scene. His name is Resmaa Menakem. And he's a therapist, and he's worked with police forces for many years in the United States and other areas as a therapist. And he got curious about why is it that white police officers are shooting so many Black and brown skinned people? And so his work of delving into that from a physiological and psychological and historical place led him to realizing that there's so much historical stuff that we're carrying. It actually impacts your genes, through epigenetics. And so that's some of the part of how we're carrying it in our bodies. But certainly we carry protective practices in our bodies, and our bodies are kind of, they react to how we're feeling. And so after years, generations, we develop these patterns in these ways of holding all of these colonial impacts in our bodies. It's really the leading edge of the work, and I've just found it so profound in my own healing journey to recognize how my body is actually holding unresolved trauma, especially through the colonial endeavor.
Right.
Thank you, Daniel, for that question.
So Sherry just put a link to, I assume it's Resmaa Menakem's website in the chat. So if people want to follow up on that, and I know that I am really interested in doing that as well. Louise.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, this is working. Okay. Thank you so much. I joined late. Jasper sent me the link, so thank you. I'm just wondering how we could get a hold of you, or where you're working and doing your thing in the community, if we wanted to reach out for more.
Yeah, I'm Colleen. If you don't, you can share my information, my contact information, and maybe just take this opportunity to say, like, I work as a consultant, as an independent consultant now. I used to work on the Health Authority on Vancouver Island. But I found that, my thinking was that even if we were able to create a culturally safe health authority on Vancouver Island, which it's a long way off from doing that, but even if we would still be dealing with these problems, because it's everywhere, right? In every sector, every part of society, we're not practicing decolonizing ways, or Indigenous cultural safety, or anti-racism. So that I wanted then to spread out and to work in other sectors as well. Yeah, and I have to tell you, there's so much interest, if you will, for this kind of work right now. Myself and my people that I work with, they're just so busy. And I think especially after the little ones were found in Kamloops, people, it broke so many people's hearts, you know, especially we as Indigenous people. That was such a terrible experience to go through, to know that these little ones are now being found. My emotions come up in this. But Canadians in general, we realized this is true, you know, there's the evidence, and it broke so many of our hearts. And I think that's just added to the interest in this work, and people realizing we have to get busy. This is real stuff, and we have to look to Indigenous people to guide this work. So yeah, the interest in this work is just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you. Do you mind if I put your email address in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, that'll work.
It's okay, I will. Thank you. Okay, I will do that right now. There you go. Yeah, so we've got just 30 seconds left. I want to say, Harley, that I spoke with you a little bit before about the work that the Reach Board are doing on decolonization and the as you've described it, the journey to around decolonization, and it is a journey. And I really appreciate your talk in describing what some of the parts of that are. And you know, it's difficult for everybody. And speaking as a non-Indigenous person, it is difficult for me because you are looking at history that you may have known somewhere in the back of your mind is real, but to actually begin to really go into it in a deep way and to see the impact that it wasn't just personal people being racist. These were policies at the highest levels, right down to the bottom levels. They were policies of genocide and harm to people. And so it's hard to read about that and to try to understand how that could possibly have happened. But it's something that everybody has to do. And so I'm sure that we will meet you again. I am absolutely positive about that. So on behalf of everybody here, I want to really say thank you to you for taking some time with us and talking to us this evening.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everybody. And can I just say the 20-second thing? Because I noticed Daniel doing some, I'm assuming it's beading or sewing work or some sort of practice. Beautiful. So we encourage that in our work. We recommend people bring knitting, crocheting, beading. I always supply arts material in our workshops because that helps us to stay present. You know, what using both your hands and it stimulates the nerve endings. It activates certain parts of your brain that we need when we're looking at very difficult topics and content like in the work that we do. So I just wanted to point that out. You know, that's a way that people stay present, and that's based on ancient wisdom that our elders tell us. Even like snacking and bringing beverages, like stimulating your senses, helps you to stay present in your body. And we need those kinds of activities in order to sort through, just as you said, Colleen, the very difficult history that we need to know about and learn about and understand how it still is in play to this day. So thank you all for listening to me, and I look forward to meeting you down the road.
Thanks.
Thank you, Harley.